Hi there. This is the final lecture on the material that's going to be covered on Exam 1 on Friday. And today we're going to talk about reaction mechanisms and catalysts. Here is a definition. The sequence of events that describes the actual process by which reactant molecules become product molecules is called a reaction mechanism. Remember a few lectures ago, I told you that sometimes the rate law of a reaction may look sort of like it resemble like the I should say the order of the rate law of a reaction may resemble the coefficients of a reaction, but sometimes that's just a coincidence. Well, in this lecture, we're going to talk about what the actual relationship is between the rate law and a chemical reaction. In particular, a chemical reaction between molecules. A reaction may occur at once, or it may recur over several steps. Usually reactions occur over several discrete steps. And if we have a reaction like that can occur over several discrete steps, we can usually propose a way to break down that reaction into these little tiny steps. And each one of these little tiny discrete steps is called an elementary reaction. If we have a reaction that occurs in more than one step, there are compounds called intermediates that are formed and later on react to eventually form the actual products in the overall reaction. Intermediates are never considered products because we never see them at the end of the overall reaction. They are made during the reaction in the course of the reaction continuing on, but at the end they are used up and they are not in the chemical equation. That brings us to another point, and that is, what is the molecularity of an elementary reaction? And again, the elementary reaction is one of the little steps that makes up the overall reaction. The molecularity of an elementary reaction tells us how many molecules must react together to form a product molecule. Sometimes it's a decomposition reaction where you start off with one molecule and it decomposes into several molecules. And in that case, we have a unimolecular elementary reaction. So if we have a reactant A, that is just one reactant, and it just decomposes into several products perhaps, then we find that the rate law for this unimolecular reaction is just simply the rate constant times the concentration of whatever that one particular reactant is. If we have a bimolecular reaction, we have two reactant molecules coming together to form products. Either they are two of the same type of compound, here we have A plus A, or one compound plus another compound, a dissimilar compound. And the rate law for this type of elementary reaction is reflected in the fact that it is a second order overall rate law, which reflects the fact that we've got two reactants coming together to form products. So the rate law for this elementary reaction is second order, and if we have two of the same molecules coming together to form products, then we just simply look at it as the concentration of A times the concentration of A times K, or the concentration of A squared. And if they are dissimilar reactants, then we have to just multiply the concentration of A times the concentration of the other reactant B. And in both of these cases, the overall rate law is second order. And that brings us to the termolecular reactions, elementary reactions. These are very rare, and we, for our purposes, will pretend that they don't exist. Think about the probability of 3 molecules smacking into each other simultaneously to form products. Now, that probability is really, really small. So that's why if we see a reaction that involves 3 reactants, 3 reactant molecules, we just assume that this reaction must be done in more than one step. And again, in the rare event that we do have a termolecular elementary reaction, the overall order of the reaction is 3, and that is reflected by the fact that we have, well, in this case, we have 3 of the same molecules coming together, so you cube the concentration of A. Here we have 2 of the same molecules coming together and 1 different one, and you see there's a pattern here. It's pretty clear that in all these cases the overall order is 3, and depending on what you have for the reactants, that will be reflected in the rate law. So getting back to the termolecular reactions, as I said just a few seconds ago, we assume that they just about never happen. And so we have to assume that we have a multi-step mechanism going on that describes the actual reaction, the actual overall reaction. In a multi-step reaction, you will always have one of the steps slower than all of the others. And this slowest step is called the rate determining step. The reaction cannot go any faster than the slowest step, and that is illustrated in these 2 cartoons. If the reaction is stalled at the first step, you have a pile-up, and eventually, in this case, they're cars in a toll plaza. The cars will eventually make it out of the toll plaza and Toll Plaza A and go through Toll Plaza B, and but still they're bunched up over here. But in this case, Toll Plaza B has the pile up, and even though they're going fast through Toll Plaza A, they're getting sort of log jammed at Toll Plaza B. But in both of these cases, the rate that the cars can go is determined by where they get stuck and how fast they can get themselves unstuck from where they're stuck. And it's the same idea with multi-step reaction mechanisms. The rate determining step can be the initial step in a multi-step mechanism, an intermediate step, or the final step. If you have more than 2 reaction or more than 2 elementary reactions in a reaction mechanism. What we're going to be focusing on are 2-step reactions. And I'm going to show you ways to determine whether or not in a 2-step reaction the slow step is the first step or the slow step is the second step. So once we talk about this, I think it will be pretty clear to you how to go about determining which step, the initial step or the final step, is the rate determining step. Let's take a look at this reaction. This reaction has a given overall rate law of the rate equals K times the concentration of hydrogen gas times the concentration of iodine monochloride. If we take a look at this reaction, if this were an elementary reaction, we should expect to see that we would have the concentration of hydrogen times the concentration of iodine monochloride squared. Well, the experimentally determined rate is this, and we see that there is no square over here. And what that tells us is that this is not an elementary reaction, and therefore it must be a this must be a multi-step reaction. And here is the proposed reaction mechanism for this reaction. Also, we see that we've got 3 molecules reacting, and as I said before, if this were an elementary reaction, then this would be classified as a termolecular elementary reaction, and we said that it's so rare that it just about never happens. So that is another clue that this must be a multi-step reaction. Well, the experimentalists, after seeing that this rate law does not suggest that we have an elementary reaction here because we're missing the 2 over here, the experimentalist proposes a reaction mechanism, and the experimentalist proposes the fact that the first step is the slow step and the second step is the fast step. Now, why did the experimentalists suggest or propose this reaction mechanism? How did they know that this is the slow step and then this is the fast step? The reason is because if you have fewer reactants represented in the rate law compared to what you have for reactants, then that suggests that the first step is the slow step. I will summarize this in a couple of slides. And if you notice that you have hydrogen iodide as a product in step 1, and then it's a reactant in step 2. Okay, notice this? But hydrogen iodide is not one of the products of the overall reaction. That's because hydrogen iodide is an intermediate. It is produced during one step and then consumed during the other step. And so it essentially cancels itself out at the end. Now let's look at what things look like when the rate determining step is the final step. Here we have a reaction. Again, we've got 3 reactant molecules, 2 nitric oxide molecules, and 1 bromine molecule. And the rate law for this reaction was experimentally found to look like so. Now, we can say that, oh, look at that. We've got the concentration of nitric oxide squared here, and we've got 2 over here, and then we have bromine here, So we have the concentration of bromine to the first power here, and we've got one bromine here. This must be a termomolecular elementary reaction because we've got the same number of concentrations in the rate law as we have molecules represented in the reactants. But again, we go back to the fact that termomolecular elementary reactions are practically non-existent. So we need to assume that we have a two-step reaction mechanism. So the proposed reaction mechanism looks like the following. This double arrow just simply means that there is an equilibrium in the mixture of nitric oxide, bromine, and then this intermediate. So we have these three components residing together in the solution, coexisting, and this is and this equilibrium is achieved quickly. If we only start off with nitric oxide and bromine gas, they will quickly go to equilibrium with our intermediate. And once this intermediate is formed, it will react with the nitric oxide that continues to be present in the mixture, because as I said, all three of these substances are coexisting in the gas mixture. So it picks up some of the nitric oxide that is still present, and then a product is formed. And so we assume here that if we see that we have the same number and type of reactant molecules represented in the rate law as in the overall reaction, we have a fast initial step and a slow final step. To summarize how to determine whether you have an initial rate determining step or a final determining step, I have the following rules. Look at the rate law and compare it to the reactants in the overall reaction. Okay, that's kind of step one. If there are missing molecules in the rate law, if there are fewer molecules represented in the rate law than there are in the reactants in the overall reactant, then you have the first step is the slow rate determining step. And then the rate law for the reaction will look like the rate law for the elementary reaction that is the slow first step. Let's take a look again at this slide. So we're looking at the rate law for this overall reaction, and we see K times the concentration of hydrogen times the concentration of iodine monochloride. We're missing a square over here to represent a termomolecular reaction. So what this tells me is because we're missing one of these guys in the rate law, then the rate determining step is the first step, and then the rate law for the overall reaction represents what the rate law would look like for this first elementary step. And it does. We have one hydrogen molecule and we have one iodine monochloride right there. Number two, if there are three molecules accounted for in the rate law and there are three reactants in the overall reaction, the last step is the slow rate determining step. And then there is an equilibrium step, the first step, that is the fast step. And the rate law will include two reactant molecules from the first fast equilibrium step and a reactant molecule from the slower step that isn't the intermediate. Let's see what that looks like. So here is the rate law, and we have the two reactant molecules in the first step represented in the rate law. So we have one nitric oxide and one bromine. And then we have a third molecule represented in the rate law that is not the intermediate. This is the intermediate. It gets produced in step 1 and consumed in step 2, and we never see it in the overall reaction. This is not the one that we will see in the rate law. It's this one. So we've got these two plus this one, and all three of those are represented in the rate law. Let's change the subject and talk about catalysts. Catalysts are very important for a lot of reactions because catalysts actually help reactions go faster. And the way they do that is by decreasing the activation energy of the reaction. And the way they decrease the activation energy of the reaction is by changing the path from reactants to products. So by going maybe instead of over the mountain, the catalysts sort of help the reaction kind of go around the mountain and avoid that peak in a mountain, if you want to think of it that way. And also, catalysts never appear as a product or a reactant. They are added, they're sort of, they kind of do work in the background. We do not acknowledge their existence in the overall reaction. Here's an example of a catalyzed reaction. So uncatalyzed, if we are taking hydrogen peroxide and we're trying to react two hydrogen peroxide molecules to form two water molecules and one oxygen molecule, this is not a very fast reaction. It has a very high activation energy. However, when we add the bromide ion as a catalyst, we have a two-step reaction. So we have a first step, the intermediate is formed over here, and then the intermediate continues to react and forms the product. By looking at this, can you tell which part of this two-step mechanism is which elementary reaction is the rate limiting reaction? If you said it should be the second step, you're correct. And it all comes down to activation energies. The activation energy, just by visual inspection, is much less to go from here to here than it is, what happened there? Than it is to go from here to here. It takes a lot less energy. So this is the rate limiting step right here, going from the intermediate to the final products. Oh, I see what happened. I went on to the next slide. There are two types of catalysts, a homogeneous catalyst and a heterogeneous catalyst. A homogeneous catalyst means that the catalyst is present in the same phase as the reactants. So in this example, we have a solution, we have an aqueous solution, and and a reaction is going on in water. And the bromide ion is in aqueous phase along with the reactants. So that's what makes the bromide ion, in this case, a homogeneous catalyst. A heterogeneous catalyst is present in a different phase than the reactant molecules, and we will see that shortly. Again, this reaction, when we introduce a catalyst, is broken down into two steps. So step one, we have the creation of an intermediate. And if you say that bromine in solution is the intermediate, you're correct. And so bromine is the product over here. It's the intermediate. And then bromine continues to react with hydrogen peroxide to restore the presence of the bromide ion in the solution, and then, oh, I think I have a typo. Yes. Oh, no, I do not have a typo. Okay, so it restores the presence of the bromide ion in solution and produces the hydrogen ion plus oxygen. Now, when you add these two reactions together, you see that the hydrogen ions cancel each other out. Here it's a reactant, here it's a product. And then you are left with, as for products anyway, you're left with water and oxygen. And of course, the bromide ions cancel each other out because one is over here and one is over here. So when you add these two steps together for the overall reaction, the bromide ion also disappears. And then we have a heterogeneous catalyst. A heterogeneous catalyst is a catalyst that is in a different phase than the reactants. So we have let's see, ethene and hydrogen coming together on this metal surface. Maybe it's platinum. And the idea here is that the hydrogen and the ethene are going to get together and form ethane. And on the surface, the hydrogen ions, or the hydrogen molecule, or hydrogen atoms, can separate and then zigzag their way over the surface to find the ethene molecule and attach themselves to the ethene molecule. So as one meanders over and finds it, it attaches, and then that end pops off of the metal surface, and then finally the second hydrogen atom finds its way over, and then the whole molecule goes on its merry way. And then just briefly, I'd like to talk about another kind of catalyst, and that's called an enzyme. And enzymes are the catalysts in biological systems, and the way they work is through a sort of a lock and key system. Enzymes are shaped geometrically in a certain way to receive a substrate, whatever that substrate may be. And the substrate in this case is hydrogen peroxide, and catalase is the enzyme. And so if we can imagine, catalase is shaped in such a way that hydrogen peroxide fits very nicely inside of it, and then while they are together, they form the enzyme substrate complex, and then some chemistry goes on, and then the enzyme releases the products. And in this case, the products are water and oxygen. Of course, there are many, many different kinds of enzymes that are designed to interact with and break down many different types of molecules, usually proteins. So here are the practice exercises. Please stop the video and solve these practice exercises, and then when you think that you've got the answers, go ahead and restart the video and see what I have to say about them. For number 1, you're going to A, write the rate law, and B, write the overall reaction. So here we have step 1 and step 2. Let me get my pen out. Okay, let's see what we've got. We've got a fast reaction here, and we have the first step is a fast reaction, and it's an equilibrium reaction. And then the second step is a slow reaction. So we go back to the rules regarding what the rate law looks like for a reaction where the initial step is fast and is an equilibrium reaction, and then the second step is a slow reaction. So let's just kind of rewind ourselves back a little bit. And so if the last step is the slow rate determining step, and then you have an equilibrium step that is the fast step, the rate law will include 2 reactant molecules from the first fast equilibrium step and a reactant molecule from the slower step that isn't the intermediate. So going back. So the rate law for this looks like course, rate equals K. So it's the 2 reactant molecules from the first step. So we have the concentration of nitric oxide squared times 1 reactant from the second step that is not the intermediate. That means not this one, because obviously that's the intermediate. It gets produced in the first step and consumed in the second step. And there we go. So here's the rate law. Now we have to write the overall reaction. So for part B, the overall reaction is just simply adding up these 2 steps. We have 2 nitric oxides plus 1 oxygen, like that. Actually, maybe what I'll do is when we write an overall reaction, okay, this isn't working. Let me get my handy eraser out. Some of my applications I can just cross it out and it goes away, but apparently not for PowerPoint. Again, we want our overall reaction to show what phase each of the reactants and products is in. So we have 2 nitric oxides reacting with 1 oxygen, 1 mole of oxygen. So 2 moles of nitric oxide plus 1 mole of oxygen forms 2 moles of nitrogen dioxide. Just like that. In question number 2, we are given an overall reaction with a rate law. And the question is, which of the following is most likely the 2-step reaction mechanism for this reaction, and why? Let's see. We've got 1 nitrogen dioxide here, and 1 carbon monoxide over here. The rate law has 2 nitrogen dioxides represented, if this were an elementary reaction. We are missing carbon monoxide in this rate law. And that tells us that we must have a reaction that has a slow first step and a fast second step. Again, even though I've got 2 molecules represented here and 2 molecules represented here, the 2 molecules represented in the rate law are not identical to what is represented in the reaction, in the chemical equation. We're missing one. We're missing carbon monoxide. So because of that, I am going to go with this. And this is the 2-step reaction mechanism that is reflected by this reaction with this chemical equation and the corresponding rate law. And remember, when you have the slow initial step and the fast final step, the rate law needs to represent, the rate law looks like the rate law for an elementary reaction represented by the first step. So it is the first elementary reaction in the overall reaction mechanism. And here we have 2 nitrogen dioxide molecules coming together, and this elementary reaction would correspond to this particular rate law. So that's another way to double check. Make sure that the initial rate limiting, if you have a reaction mechanism where the initial step is the slow step, is the rate limiting step, then the rate law for the overall reaction should look like the rate law for this elementary reaction, and it does. That's all I've got for you today, and I will see you on Friday.